Now, okay, so you said earlier, and I want to just jump, I want to keep
Okay.
things a little wild here. So you said you sing quite a bit of 18th century music yourself. You sing some
Mhm.
Bach and you sing. So, okay, are they distinct eras, epochs in music? Are they totally different? Are we in the world of tonal music, as Fétis would say? And is that a different, is your Renaissance training not really useful for the 18th century, or do you find there are some echoes or even full relevance in a different era like the 18th century?
Sure. I think it's maybe important to separate two different concepts here. One is historically, what's going on in terms of the theory, the practice, and the composition, and one is what it means to be a singer today in the early music movement. So historically, there are obviously huge parallels. We looked at that Marchand example in the 18th
Hmm.
century, and you could have almost taken it out of a not very good 16th century counterpoint textbook and plonked it onto some 18th century plain chant. Plain chant, of course, being the thread which connects all these things together,
Hmm.
right? But as of course you know, you can talk about solmization, 6 note, 7 note, 4 note solmization throughout this period as well. And there are huge parallels in that sense. There are certain parallels in terms of compositional practice, of course, lots of differences as well. Um, so there are lots of parallels that you can draw upon. Apart from anything, it's increasingly clear that a lot of 18th century musicians performed earlier music regularly. The famous example is Bach, who had this, we know, had this collection. What was it called? Florilegium Hortense or something like that, which is a collection of motets by Lassus and his contemporaries. So we know
He
that
did,
Bach,
huh?
yeah, Bach
Oh,
would have
okay.
performed. I think it's even on IMSLP if you want to grab it up for the viewers.
Let's pull it up.
Yeah. So we know that, for example, Bach was performing probably as actually the bread and butter of his job, performing 16th and early 17th century music. So I think it's difficult to talk about a direct break between modal and tonal theory. Modal theory was still and is still um, widely discussed during this period. I had a student just on Monday who was talking about when did he said something like when did modal, and if you're watching this, sorry, he said something like when did people stop using modes? But it's not really, sort of never. If you look at a modern plain chant book, you can organize everything according to modes, and indeed it is organized according to mode. In the 18th and 19th century, plain chant especially was still organized by mode. Yeah, so here we are. This is the lovely collection Florilegium Hortense, which Bach would have had and would have sung from, would have worked from. Um, However, that's not really what you asked. Sorry, I got sidetracked ever so slightly. Um,
Oh, just yeah, just the using Renaissance skill and all what you've just talked about for the last couple of hours. Like in 18th century, do you find that thread? And is that thread those skills a Renaissance musician's skills? Would he thrive in the 18th century? I mean, well, he'd have work in a church, of course, but but again, looking at 18th century Baroque and Galant music.
so looking at 18th century Baroque and gallant music, and looking at 18th century compared to 16th century descriptions of
Mhm.
the expectations of a singer, for example, because let's talk about singers for the moment, there are clearly a lot of differences in terms of what seems to be vocal expectations, although, of course, gleaning sort of aesthetic ideals from the written word is difficult. But there certainly seem to be some differences between 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century sources on singing. The notation is very different. Of course, a 16th century musician is used to 16th century notation, and 18th century notation, it's maybe it's different. Let's say less different than 15th century to 18th century, but there are differences there. Things like chants sur le livre were still widespread in France, but for example, I don't, as far as I know, don't think the Bach singers would have indulged in it very often, if at all. Um, the approach to ornamentation in the 16th century, for example, ensemble ornamentation is widely documented in the 16th century with lots of people ornamenting at the same time or in a polyphonic texture, let's say, but it's not documented quite so clearly in the 18th century, or at least not in the same way. So there are some clear distinctions there. However, the perhaps since you mentioned sort of my own experience, this is a little bit of a different question because um, it talks a little bit about what are the expectations of a singer in the early music movement. And realistically, most singers that you meet in the early music movement are freelancers. They have to be able to jump, even if they're specialists in early music, they have to
Mm.
be able to jump between Bach to Palestrina to Schütz to, I don't know, Pergolesi, etc. Perhaps even, jumping to Mozart, perhaps even going further, Beethoven,
Mm.
whatever. Unlikely to find a person who sings both Bach and Palestrina and Wagner, but hey, probably there are people out there, and I'm sorry if I've
Yeah.
neglected you in saying that you don't exist. Um, so the reality, I think, is that in the early music world, we need to, as singers, be pretty much able to do lots of different things. And unlike a violinist or, I don't know, whoever, we can't pick up a different instrument. We can't restring our violin with using different materials. We can't find a different lute. We can't get a lute in different tuning. We can't find a lute in with a different number of courses, etc. We have to work with basically the same instrument that we use for speaking, that we use for the same instrument I'm using now to talk with you. I'm going to talk with my friends in the pub in a few days' time. I'm going to sing in a concert of Bach. I'm going to sing in a concert of Palestrina, etc. So we have certain limitations physically, I think, in terms of how flexible we can be. And there are some very, very flexible singers out there, but we're expected, what I'm trying to say in an extremely roundabout way, is that we're expected to sing everything, basically, in a way that I
Mm.
think, in all sorts of different styles, in a way that singers from the past might not have been expected to in quite the same way.
Mm. But
Um,
yeah, what I wanted to know is if you look at, I don't know, the Mass in B minor by Bach, or it's just something that's from the 18th century, and would your sudden see this is, I just want to know, the Renaissance glasses come on, and you're seeing things that people might not see if you were not trained in Renaissance counterpoint and polyphony and plain chant and that. So that's what I'm asking is,
oh yeah, I see. I
do you
see.
have the special Renaissance glasses that, because I know this is true for all these harpsichordists. I give them 19th century music. I said this appoggiatura, that appoggiature,
Mm,
and then they rip apart 19th century romantic music, just tear it apart, and
yeah.
just like, you're supposed to be a 17th century harpsichordist. What are you doing? Just thoroughly analyzing this romantic music. So in the same way, when you have these Renaissance goggles on, I mean, when you look at 18th century sacred music or whatever, um, do, do you see some things happening, some threads that sort of maintain in an odd way?
Yeah, of course. I mean, a good example is solmization. We mentioned inganno techniques earlier. They can often be quite clear in later, especially Italianate schools of composition. You mentioned Bach's B minor Mass. That's a great example because so much of it is reminiscent of the Prima Pratica, right? Credo in unum Deum. It's of course a plain chant melody, right? But the way of setting it feels like it could almost be taken out of Palestrina with a few twists here and there. So I'm sure that I do view things in a certain way as somebody who spends most of his life singing Renaissance music, and I'm sure that I do sort of superimpose some of these expectations and yeah judgments onto later music. Uh, a nice example might be talking about modality and tonality, looking at how later composers might set earlier tunes, especially chorale melodies. There are some interesting comparisons to be made between earlier and later styles of thinking vertically, let's say, of organizing pitch content.